from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight, the big trade deadline day that wasn't.
The president has hit a 90-day pause button, and we are moving quickly with many of our most important trading partners.
He's hoping that there will be good deals made before the 90 days is up, and we will cut those deals as soon as we possibly can.
Howard, how many countries have we spoken to already? 90. And they all want to make deals, and we're going to make deals. You know, I call those other countries, to say, and every one of them is willing to give us everything now, by the way, just so you know.
The several new tariff demand letters unveiled by the president today, with the big news coming in just moments ago, a 50% tariff on goods from Brazil. That plus news on imports from Algeria, Libya, Iraq, and more. Still, the flurry of letters this week, a far cry from the 90 deals in 90 days mantra that's been coming from the White House since the so-called Liberation Day rates pause. We're going to take you to the White House, plus a look at how the markets are reacting. And we'll look as well at the state of play on those sought-after trade agreements when we speak with Deputy Treasury Secretary Michael Faulkender just a few moments from now.
Plus, why Harvard may fail to meet accreditation standards heading into the next school year. With just weeks before students descend on Cambridge, the new escalation in the administration's war with elite universities up ahead. And
Russia launching its largest drone attack on Ukraine just hours after Vladimir Putin heard this.
We get a lot of thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
The escalating war in Ukraine, despite a continued push for a peace agreement, and the tough Russia sanctions bill that could make its way through Congress when retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman joins us up ahead. But we begin tonight with developments on the trade front. The president announcing new tariff letters to half a dozen countries today. Day that would have been the administration's original trade deadline date, with Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Sri Lanka getting a 30% rate, Brunei and Moldova 25% duty, and a 20% rate on goods from the Philippines, and now a fat 50% on Brazil, announced just a short time ago.
As for how exactly those rates were calculated, this is how the president explained it earlier today.
The formula was a formula based on common sense, based on deficits, based on how we've been treated over the years, and based on raw numbers.
We have Bloomberg's Laura Davison here in Washington reporting on the politics of all of this, and Romaine Bostick joining us from World Headquarters in New York as well. But we'll begin with Laura here on set with us. So, Laura, when we consider the letters we got today, I believe the total number of letters now stands at 22, but the 7 from earlier accounted for less than $20 billion in terms of what is imported into the U.S. Brazil, though, much bigger fish, much bigger tariff rate, and it seems like different tariff justification as the president's talking about insidious attacks against former President Bolsonaro in his letter.
Yes, indeed. And Brazil actually had an original 10% tariff on Liberation Day. This 50% is the largest delta we've seen of any of these countries that have come out so far. And the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Brazil. So unlike the justification of this being based at least some part on trade deficits, this seems to be much more about politics. In the announcement that the president put out, he mentioned that this was a witch hunt against Bolsonaro. And this seems to be a completely different justification, almost in a separate bucket, which may suggest that this may be on a different negotiating track than some of the other letters we've seen over the past 3 days.
It's a separate bucket in that it's a different piece of writing as well. There was essentially a form letter that's gone out with different numbers to most of the countries that we've seen so far. And the president framed this essentially as an invitation, not a threat, but an invitation to invest in the United States. What are we hearing back from any of these countries, if at all yet?
This, at least in Brazil, the market reaction was very swift and very violent. You saw financial markets and post-hour trading falling. Other countries, however, have said they're still continuing to negotiate. The president made it clear in those form letters that if you retaliate, we are going to hit you back with those same amounts, not unlike kind of the tit-for-tat increasing of tariffs we saw with China in April. But countries are really seeing August 1 now as this new deadline, but that's only 3 weeks away, doesn't give them a lot of time. And as we noted before, there have not been a significant number of deals reached, which means that the administration still has a very short amount of time to hash out a lot of details with a lot of countries that are getting more and more desperate.
It's great to have you with us, Laura Davison, as always, in Washington. Joining us now for a closer look. Let's go to the source into the administration's trade strategy is Michael Faulkender, Deputy Treasury Secretary. And Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got a lot of letters here. I've been reading through them all day long, and pretty interesting to see where some of these are going. Iraq, Brunei, Libya, in some cases countries that we don't even have $1 billion a year worth of trade with. Why this group now, and do we risk sending them into the arms of China?
So what we're trying to do is, as the president explained at the cabinet meeting, is address these long-standing tariff and non-tariff barriers that have caused a lot of our manufacturing to be exported abroad. And what we're doing is methodically going through country by country. And for those for whom we're having robust conversations still, then those conversations are still ongoing. But we're also letting partner nations know that if they don't reach an agreement, there is a number that's going to go into effect as a result of us not coming to a deal. So this continues to be part of our ongoing discussions to incentivize countries to bring forth, again, not just their statutory tariff levels, but the non-tariff barriers that have impeded the ability of U.S. manufacturers and exporters to really access those markets.
What countries currently fall into that current robust conversations bucket?
So, the Secretary has mentioned that we're really focused one-on-one with the top 18 economies with which we do a lot of trade. So those negotiations are still, for the most part, in robust and ongoing. We already have a deal with the UK, but there are other conversations. Again, I'm always hesitant to get too far ahead of an announcement that the White House has not yet been made, but we continue to have very senior level conversations with our top trading partners to get to deals before August 1st.
We want to ask you about a lot more, including the president's big, beautiful bill that you're going to be traveling the country to implement. But in terms of that August 1st deadline, the president says it's not going to move. How many deals can you generate in just 20 some odd days?
Again, we have been having these conversations all the way since not just April 2nd, but since the beginning of the administration. And so there's enormous progress that have been made with many of these countries. And for some of them, it is just finalizing some of the terms of the framework. Now, obviously, the details of the trade agreement will be worked out well beyond August 1st, but a general framework is the objective to have by August 1st.
Well, when we consider, to Joe's point, the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill and how that's going to alter the revenue that the Treasury Department actually sees coming in, how are you factoring in the changes we're about to see take place now that this bill is law with what's going to happen in regard to tariffs and what that will do to the Treasury's coffers? So
a lot of what we have been communicating to the American people, not just back to the campaign, but as well this year, is that we really do need to think about the full implementation of the president's economic agenda. It is reworking these trade deals. It is the implementation of an extension of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as these additional pieces: no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, immediate expensing for factories. And then in addition to that, we've got the deregulatory agenda on which we continue to make progress. The combination of all of those things we see as generating significant economic growth, improvements in wages, and as a result, bringing down deficits over time. Couple that with the spending reductions. A lot of people don't talk about the $1.6 trillion in spending reductions that we have in the One Big Beautiful Bill, but also we have a rescissions package in front of the Congress right now, and there are more to come, provided that Congress works with us on this first rescissions package. So we need to make sure that we have robust economic growth to keep revenues growing. We need to get spending under control over time, and then in the process, bring down deficits. Couple that in with the tariff revenue that's coming in, and we're projecting that we are going to start getting our fiscal house in order.
Well, I'm fascinated by the job you have right now, because while everyone's, sort of celebrating the job being finished on Capitol Hill, yours is just beginning to implement this law. And of course, we've got a tax season to prepare for here with some major tax policy changes. How much time do you have to get this on the books? What's the next couple of months like for you?
So tax filing season opens in January, and we need to have everything implemented. So a lot of it gets backdated in the law to January 1st of this year, which means that when we open filing season next January, all of that needs to be implemented. But that's not really the deadline, because for many of these things, we need to get guidance out. We need to start doing taxpayer education and tax preparer education activities right now. And so we are rushing to make some policy decisions that were delegated to Treasury in this in the statutory language, and then get guidance out and get rulemaking completed. So for us at Treasury, Implementation is a much bigger lift than the negotiation, and our work really started on Monday following the president signing the bill last Friday.
Well, of course, in addition to implementing changes to the tax code, the Treasury also has to enforce other things like sanctions, for example. And we know there is a live conversation happening, certainly in the U.S. Senate, spearheaded by Senator Lindsey Graham, around further sanctions on Russia. What are you hearing from leaders on Capitol Hill and from the White House about what role the Treasury might have to play in stricter sanctions enforcement moving forward?
Right. So as you both know, Treasury is where we implement sanctions and enforce them. One of the benefits of being the world's reserve currency is that because foreign countries and foreign financial institutions want access to our markets and our financial system, they are going to comply with any sanctions that we impose. And so they are one of the most important tools in the foreign policy toolkit of the president. And Treasury stands ready, irrespective of what we're ready to work with Congress. We continue to provide technical assistance, and if Congress enacts a law, we will go forward in implementing. But even if Congress does not proceed with it, we continue to work very closely with the National Security Council to identify ways that we can put even more leverage on the Russians to come to a deal. Because as the president has said, this war never should have started. We are going to see it brought to an end, and we are going to use our sanctions authorities to facilitate giving leverage to the president to bring a peaceful end, so that on both sides of that battle, we stop seeing the battlefield deaths that just never should have been had.
Okay, that's interesting, though. Does that mean that you're in touch with Senator Lindsey Graham or other leaders on the nuances around this legislation as it's being written?
Anytime the Treasury Department is impacted by a potential piece of legislation, we provide technical assistance, because ultimately we need to make sure that whether it's a tax law, whether it's sanctions, whether it's banking regulations, anything that hits Treasury authorities, we need to make sure that we are given the technical aspects of the law are going to allow us to do what we need to do. And so anytime there is a statute under consideration, we work closely with the staff of the authors of that legislation to make sure that we're given the authorities and the tools that we are needed in order to achieve the objective of the legislation. And that's a process known as technical assistance that's done in collaboration with the White House.
One final question before we let you go, sir. The president said on Truth Social today our Fed rate is at least 3 points too high. What would happen to the U.S. economy if the Fed were actually to cut rates by 300 basis points?
Well, again, what we're seeing is that inflation numbers are coming in well below what people thought they were going to be. We have not seen the tariffs that have been implemented so far being passed along in the form of higher prices. And, if you look at our interest rates in this country relative to the rest of the world, ours look rather high. And so, as the president has said, there is room for the Federal Reserve to reevaluate where they've currently got interest rates set. And if we bring down interest rates, that follows through to mortgage rates, that follows through to the rates of borrowing that we have at Treasury. Other than Social Security payments, debt service right now is the number 2 expenditure for the federal government. And if we can significantly bring down rates, then as we refinance the debt, we're going to be doing it at lower costs, and that's going to bring down, again, some of these fiscal deficits.
All right, Michael Faulkender, thank you so much for joining us here in studio. He, of course, is the Deputy Treasury Secretary. And now, as we consider how financial markets are looking at everything we just discussed with the Deputy Secretary, we turn to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who is joining us from World Headquarters in New York. And Romaine, there was a lot of action to watch today.
A lot of action to watch. I mean, during the cash session, you had a market that flirted with record highs, and that was largely on the back of some monster gains out of Microsoft and NVIDIA, both closing at record highs on the day. In fact, NVIDIA on an intraday basis at one point crossed a market valuation of $4 trillion, the first time that's ever happened for a publicly traded company here in the United States. And it really adds to this idea that there is a lot of risk on sentiment in this market. But as we got past the market close, there was a quick reminder of all of the risks that are still out there, particularly when it comes to tariffs and trade. You see that reflected in the headlines with regards to Brazil, a 50% tariff rate for a market that was expecting a tariff rate in the 10 to 20% range. You saw a swift drop, weakness in the Brazilian real, a swift drop in one of the main ETFs tracking Brazilian stocks. And here in the after-hour session, the biggest movers in the U.S. market are the ADRs, the American Depository Receipts of major Brazilian companies like Embraer, which is down 7%, LATAM Airlines down 4%, and several other names that could potentially be affected by this. And to the point that the Assistant Treasury Secretary was making just a little while ago, the big concern right now, Kelly and Joe, is whether these tariffs, not just on Brazil, but some of the other countries, will indeed be inflationary, particularly at a time when a lot of the goods that we buy, particularly from Brazil, like cocoa, like steel, like aircraft, might actually continue to see higher prices.
Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. We thank you as ever. Overseas now, where Hamas says it has agreed to release 10 Israeli hostages amid ongoing ceasefire talks. That news coming as the president today was asked about a potential deal following a reported meeting between U.S., Israeli and Qatari officials.
I will tell you we're getting very close to a deal. I don't know if it's secret or not secret, but it doesn't matter to me. Secret's fine if it gets us to where we want to be. We want to have a ceasefire. We want to have peace. We want to get the hostages back. And I think we're close to doing it.
Those comments from the president coming as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth today at the Pentagon.
We'll have more on that story coming up as we stay focused on geopolitics after the break. Up next, Russia launching a record-setting drone strike on Ukraine hours after President Trump castigated Vladimir Putin. We'll discuss with retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former director of European Affairs for the National Security Council, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Yesterday, you said that you were not sure who ordered the munitions halted to Ukraine. Have you since been able to figure that out?
Well, I haven't thought about it because we're looking at Ukraine right now and munitions, but I have not gone into it.
What does it say that such a big decision could be made inside your government without you knowing?
I would know. If a decision was made, I will know. I'll be the first to know. In fact, most likely I'd give the order, but I haven't done that yet.
The President of the United States earlier today fielding questions about the apparent reversal in arms shipments to Kyiv, with President Trump now promising to send more munitions to the country so it can defend itself. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Overnight, Russia unleashed its largest attack on Ukraine with a record 728 drones only hours after Trump made that pledge to send more military aid to Kyiv. The attack was the latest in a series of escalating air assaults in recent weeks that shows no end in sight to a war now in its fourth year. Joining us for more, retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former Director of European Affairs on the National Security Council. He is currently Senior Advisor at Vote Vets. Lieutenant Colonel, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Your thoughts about the window that we are in right now and the ability for Kyiv to defend itself. How quickly do we need to get defensive weaponry specifically to Kyiv so it can defend itself against this onslaught from Russia?
Sure. I think this is always this is the one domain where the Ukrainians have particularly significant challenges. The interceptors for Patriot missile batteries, the ability to defeat Russia's use of cruise missiles and drones is going to be a challenge. And if the U.S. is not there providing support, providing these kind of munitions, then the Ukrainians are going to be under significant pressure. Is it decisive to the outcome of the war? Not necessarily, but is it allow the Russians to rain terror on Ukrainian cities and put pressure on Ukraine? Absolutely. So the U.S. could play a major role in alleviating those this terror campaign, or it could sit on the sidelines. And I think everybody's trying to figure out how much of this is noise, how much of this is signal. The Ukrainians, the Russians, how much the U.S. is willing to support Ukraine and push back on Russia. And based on the, frankly, regular flip-flops, it's hard to understand where this administration is going with pronouncements from the Pentagon saying that munitions are going to be held up, and the president yesterday saying that this wasn't his idea and that he's planning on continuing to support Ukraine.
Well, yes, President Trump suggesting now that the U.S. will continue the flow of defensive weapons, having what seems to be increasingly harsh criticism of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And it seems the response that is generating from Russia is only to further intensify its attacks, having the opposite of perhaps what the intended effect is. Is this only going to result in Vladimir Putin doubling down continually in response to potentially a greater threat of a united U.S.-Ukraine front?
I think that's exactly what's going to happen, and it's primarily because of the inconsistency of the Trump administration. The pivot from day one from the Trump administration has been from a, let's say, an ambiguous or somewhat tepid response to Russian aggression over the course of the Biden administration or preceding administrations. This is kind of what I write about in my book. We were very, very cautious to make sure we wouldn't provoke Russia, and to the detriment of emboldening Russia to be increasingly aggressive. Trump has taken this policy and has been, less ambiguous in that he's sided with Russia consistently. He's accommodated Russia's wishes and worldview, and that right now is resulting in the Russians being more emboldened to conduct these attacks. And even in light of the pronouncements from Trump yesterday, they think that this is an administration that could easily be potentially swayed and persuaded. Now, what I've been writing about relatively consistently is the biggest impediment to Trump's desire for peace, which is something that he's been really keen on, whether that's the Middle East and Israel-Gaza or Russia-Ukraine war, where he's declared that there would be peace on day one, is not the Ukrainians or the fact that the U.S. was supporting the Ukrainians to fight on. It was the fact that the Russians were not the least bit flexible. They were maximalist in their desires to subdue Ukraine. And the fact that we fed into this idea, breaking our relationships with our traditional allies, separating from the Ukrainians, has emboldened Russia. And they've got little incentive at this point in time to kind of hold back, restrain, when you have an administration that is so favorable towards Russia's worldview.
A lot of our listeners and viewers know you or first heard of you because of a phone call that you were on or listened to on July 25th, 2019, the perfect phone call. A lot has happened, of course, between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky since then. We've seen them in any number of forums, including the meltdown in the Oval Office and a very important and poignant photograph of them talking at the Vatican. What is the nature of their relationship now?
I think they've hit a relatively kind of stable relationship at this point. Trump has generally considered smaller states as very, very, let's say, they're sacrificial, that he could impose his will on them. The fact that the Ukrainians are holding their ground on the battlefield, conducting pretty interesting and unique operations, pointing to the way that the West will conduct the future of war. Zelensky holding his ground, even though that Oval Office meeting kind of derailed the relationship for a short spell. I think that muscular response from Zelensky, as well as the fact that he's willing to work and accommodate the president's desires to bring about an end to this war, have put him in a relatively good position. Whereas Putin, on the other hand, has mouthed the right words, has said he's interested in peace, but, and that's been the consistent theme, is yes, I want peace, but. And this but has been the biggest sticking point, because there is no condition or criteria that the Putin regime is willing to accept. Right now, their interests are that they think that they could win through attritional warfare. They think that they could win through the Trump administration delivering on a silver platter, kind of breaking relationships with Ukraine and Europeans. So the incentive is for them to fight on. And Trump is coming around to it, realizing it. And I think that could result in a pivot towards supporting Ukraine.
All right. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. Thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. Some of the other stories we're following in today's Bloomberg Power Brief now. Linda Yaccarino, the CEO of Elon Musk's social media platform X, says she is stepping down. Started at the company in 2023 after Musk fired or lost 75% of the company's employees, tasked with reversing an advertising exodus spurred in part by Musk's erratic posts and controversial content moderation policies. In a statement, Yaccarino said X is truly a digital town square for all voices and the world's most powerful culture signal. We couldn't have achieved that without the support of our users, business partners, and the most innovative team in the world, unquote.
The former White House physician under President Biden is refusing to answer questions as part of a congressional investigation into the former president's health while in office. Through his attorney, Dr. Kevin O'Connor invoked doctor-client privilege and his rights under the Fifth Amendment during an appearance earlier today before the House Oversight Committee. President Trump ordered the investigation into his predecessor, claiming Biden aides hid his, quote, cognitive decline. Allegations that President Biden calls ridiculous and false.
The Trump administration is warning Harvard University its accreditation may be in danger over potential violations of federal anti-discrimination laws involving anti-Semitism on its campus. Separately, the Department of Homeland Security subpoenaed Harvard in an effort to gain information on foreign students. In a statement, the university said it complies with all accreditation standards, is far from indifferent on anti-Semitism, and called the subpoenas unwarranted. These latest moves cast doubt on the progress of negotiations between the administration and the university, despite these words from the president earlier today.
Are you still optimistic about reaching a deal with the university?
Oh, yeah, I think so. Harvard's been very bad, totally anti-Semitic. And, yeah, they'll absolutely reach a deal.
Joining us now with their reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel. Roger Fisk is with us, former aide to President Obama and Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, founder and principal of Blue Stack Strategies. Welcome to you both. Roger, as we just heard the president suggest he thinks Harvard ultimately will want to make a deal. Harvard has proven to be the higher educational institution that has been least willing to acquiesce to the desires of this administration. Who's ultimately going to blink first as they continue to just ramp up this fight against each other?
Well, first off, Kaylee and Joe, thank you for having me. Wonderful to be here with Maura. To jump ahead, there will be a day when there is no President Trump, and I guarantee you there will be a Harvard. But between now and then, this is just a cornucopia of cultural warfare, red meat for the president's base. You can picture how people interpret this and kind of make a correlation between this and how he's going after some of the trade issues and how he's going after some of the resourcing of jobs. And it all just kind of gets lumped into this larger kind of fighter brand that he has. Clearly, it's very personal. Maybe it's about his own applications years ago, or maybe it's about his son or something like that. I don't know. But it's producing tremendous political value for him, but only with his base, which very often is kind of his North Star in most things.
That's right. Maura, I wonder if you can weigh in on this, because this is clearly, to Roger's point, good politics for President Trump. Is it also good politics for Harvard to keep pushing back and we never see a deal?
Well, I agree with Roger. That Trump will not be here in a few years. He obviously can't run again. Hopefully he doesn't try something. But I think that the bigger picture here is that this has been a rough week in terms of the Trump administration's standing with MAGA. You saw the Epstein fallout with the list and Pam Bondi and all that, and they're trying to find some wins here. And that's what I think this is. Between that and, saying they're going after Brennan and Comey, they're trying to remind MAGA that they are fighting what they believe to be wokeism and corruption and all these things. So they say that they're still fighting them. They say that they still want answers and transparency and all these things. And that's what this is. It's a Trump fighting what he finds to be, an injustice against him because they didn't bow to him. And unfortunately, I don't see how that's helping us find jobs. I don't see how that's helping us lower grocery costs. And so this is personal.
Well, and he's fighting fights not just domestically, but abroad as well. If we look at the most recent tariff letter that was issued, it's for Brazil. A 50% tariff is what's threatened on August 1st. And Maura, he leads the letter by talking about the treatment of the former president Bolsonaro and the insidious attacks in Brazil on free elections and free speech, suggesting that trade policy is somehow going to be leverage for better treatment of this one individual. Is that really how tariffs should be working?
again, this is the problem with the president going out with these personal vendettas is because it takes away from what the initial messaging goal here was. He said that he wanted trade policy to be more fair and that the U.S. was being taken advantage of. That worked well for large portions of the Republican Party, but also the American electorate at large. Nobody likes to be feeling like they're being taken advantage of. So that part of the messaging and the reason why he was so obsessed about tariffs, that all made sense until he went about it the way that he did. This example with Brazil, that just shows us that this isn't about finding jobs, trying to make sure that the middle of America, blue-collar workers have those opportunities and have those jobs to bring manufacturing home, which are all important goals. But this tells us just blatantly that the goal is to get back at the people of Brazil. My other concern with the tariff letters, as somebody who wrote correspondence for the Speaker of the House at one point in time, is the letters themselves. This is not professional. This is just truly, they're pretty egregious. And if I had my red pen out, I'd have a lot of work to do on these letters.
Yeah, well, we've got a stack of them here. A lot of them went out today. And interesting, they're all dated July 9th, which was supposed to be the deadline. If we remember correctly, the president, though, says we don't remember correctly. In his cabinet meeting yesterday, he talked about the confusion around what is now an August 1st tariff deadline. Listen.
It's always been August 1st. That's when we're paying. A statement was put out today, and I put it out just to make it clear. It wasn't a change. It was August 1st. We don't change very much. Every time we put out a statement, they say he made a change. I didn't make a change. A clarification, maybe. No, August 1st they pay.
Hey, Roger, we could play the tape when he said it was 90 days. It, of course, ended July 9th. So you're going to believe him or your Lion calendar?
Just wait another day. I think by my count, this is the 57th change to tariffs, either in the amount or the date or anything else. But to connect the dots here, it's important to remember on the Harvard situation that it was a letter that went out, and then they said it wasn't supposed to go out, and all this stuff. So there's just this kind of bureaucratic shrapnel flying all over the place, which is, to Maura's point, just more a statement about professionalism and competence than anything else. The threshold for getting out a letter with the president's signature on it should be extremely high. And then in addition to that, in it or in his comments about it, he said a president should not be threatening people on social media, which I just had to think, well, pot, meat, kettle, because, because of obviously the president's personal appetite for vigorous discourse, shall we say, on social media. So the whole thing, I don't think, meets the bar of anything professional, and it feels very impulsive and very random.
Well, and the president also suggests that these letters in and of themselves, Roger, are deals. This from the president who prides himself on being a deal maker. This isn't usually how we'd see him categorizing a deal.
He has a tendency, and I've said this before and I have no problem saying it, he's very good at the optics and the spectacle, but he actually thinks that that's policy. So when he stepped over the 38th parallel into North Korea, he thinks that that was the deal with Kim Jong-un. And you can see this go on. And so if he just announces something as a deal, then he thinks that somehow that the bureaucratic kind of diplomatic elements of it just kind of get worked out. And so the substance of it, all these trade deals, it's not necessarily about percentage of this or percentage of that. It's about verification. It's about remedy. It's about enforcement. All these things that take years to really get very granular down to the 0.001% of something to hammer out. That's what takes the time. The 6%, the 8%, the 12%, that's kind of ballpark stuff that they all agree on before they sit down. It's how do you actually implement and monitor the implementation of the trade agreement? And that's, I think, the policy elements that this particular administration just really doesn't have an appetite for.
The market cares about this stuff a lot, even if maybe less lately. We've seen investors taking this very much in stride with an S&P 500 that's not that far from all-time highs. Maura, is the president smarter than all of us to know that voters didn't have July 9th circled on the calendar? Nobody's paying attention to any of the minutia behind any of this tariff news, and that this is good politics to be seen or to be caught in the act?
Well, like I mentioned, with the issue with the Epstein thing, and you saw some MAGA fallout, at a certain point, if he continues to rewrite history and say, well, I didn't say that, and you play the tapes, people need to figure out for themselves. Can they continue to believe him? Do they stand with him? You know, he's talked about these short-term pains for long-term gains. How long do they hold on? You know, with these tariffs, that's a tax, and largely it's a tax on the American consumer. And so it will be a question for those strongholds, those loyalists, to decide how much longer they can hold on to someone who really hasn't shown up for them in the ways that affects them financially. I have one other comment I have to make, because when we were just talking about that Trump says something where he goes into the 30th parallel and believes that's a North Korea deal, it makes me think of The Office, where Michael Scott screams out, "I declare bankruptcy," and thinks that's it. I am constantly reminded, unfortunately, of our president and Michael Scott being very similar in some ways.
Top that.
Yeah. Now I'm just thinking of a bunch of Office references more, but I want to talk about an office you used to work in, the office, as you mentioned, of the Speaker of the House, as we consider policy still ahead, knowing the president also has promised to reduce the size of the federal government and reduce government spending. Rescissions are required formally in order to do that for money previously appropriated by Congress. Do you see a clear path for rescissions, at least the package currently under consideration, to pass the United States Senate?
It's going to be tough. I mean, if we didn't learn anything from this past, debacle as far as the One Big Beautiful Bill and how hard it was to get some of these senators to agree to the cuts that they didn't want to make, and to agree to not having as many cuts as they wanted to make, this is going to hurt them even more so. I think that was child's play in comparison to what's coming, just because the cuts that need to be made in terms of our federal debt and our national debt, they're not coming from the place that Congress is currently looking at. Realistically speaking, they need to come from the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security funds. They're not going to. Congress wouldn't touch that because, to be honest, the lobbying that's done in Capitol Hill for those programs is astronomical. But I still think that where they end up finding the cuts is going to be very painful. And without the assurances from the White House to come back to their districts, to come back to their communities, to explain to their constituents with them why this needs to be done, it's going to be tough on those who are up for re-election and up for a tight re-election.
We're going to be talking with Senator Bill Cassidy in a moment, who is up with a gig worker benefits bill. Is this the kind of approach we need to see? Maybe you don't want to specifically weigh in on that legislation, but finding more creative ways to cover people in the presence of cuts to Medicaid.
I think it's something that we should welcome, separating oneself from whether or not you even agree with it. But at least it's something that a Republican senator is putting on the table that seems to be relatively well thought out and is actually for something. Because right now their entire posture is one of kind of scalpel/chainsaw. So anytime someone, I think, comes forward in good faith with something that, at least on its face, is well-intentioned and well thought out, that all of us should welcome that, because clearly that's been an element of the workforce that's been elusive to get our arms around in terms of benefits and giving some kind of framework so that these folks can plan for the future.
Great conversation with Roger Fisk and Maura Gillespie. We thank you both, with apologies to Michael Scott. We see you, Scranton. Coming up, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem's repeated calls to wind down FEMA, just as its council met earlier today. Amid search and rescue efforts still underway in Texas, we'll bring you the latest. Also, Senate Republicans eyeing changes to President Trump's rescissions package. We'll talk about that and a lot more with Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. He's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We want to wean off of FEMA, and we want to bring it down to the state level. A little bit like education, we're moving it back to the states so the governors can handle it. That's why they're governors now. If they can't handle it, they shouldn't be governor. But these governors can handle it, and they'll work in conjunction with other governors. They'll give each other a hand. But the FEMA thing has not been a very successful experiment. Very, very expensive, and it doesn't get the job done.
President Trump last month discussing his plans to overhaul FEMA. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington here on Bloomberg TV and radio. The administration has now created the FEMA Review Council, it's called, to provide recommendations for how to reform and dismantle the agency. And today, as that group met, a renewed call from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem calling for FEMA to be wound down, and despite the agency playing a central role in recovery efforts in Texas. And joining us now, the reporter behind our FEMA story, Bloomberg's Myles Miller, who covers Homeland Security. Myles, where's this all going?
Yeah, the secretary said in her remarks that the FEMA should be eliminated as it existed. What she's calling for is an overhaul that looks a lot more like FEMA being a agency run by the federal government, but really with the power delegated to the states. What she is saying is that it should be state and locally led rather than the way it's been operated now. And really getting to the heart of the issue, what her contention is that so many times FEMA dollars have been misspent. That's what she said. And she said that a lot of times FEMA does not get on the ground in the right ways. What we know is that in Texas, the disaster response is being led primarily by Texas's Disaster Recovery Agency, and they are being supported by FEMA. Now, the emergency declaration that was declared by the president just a few days ago is narrowly focused on Kerr County, but there is devastation in several parts of Texas. And so FEMA aid would only go to that one county, and that is one of the reasons why the secretary is saying that FEMA needs a big change. There have been instances in the past, including right here in New York, where FEMA dollars went to hotels for migrants, emergency funds being used in ways that the secretary thinks is inappropriate. And so that is the central contention of why she thinks FEMA should be broken up. But another thing to talk about is the fact that FEMA right now is in a state of disarray with the response coordinator currently not even in a role because we know he took time off and then eventually left the agency.
All right, Bloomberg's Myles Miller, thank you so much. And joining us now for more on FEMA and other issues, including his legislative push to make it easier for gig workers to access employer-insured health care, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, chair of the Senate Help Committee, is joining us live from Capitol Hill. Senator, we do want to get to the Unlocking Benefits for Independent Workers Act, but given the unfolding disaster still in Texas, knowing you represent a state that is no stranger to natural disasters, what does it reveal to you about changes that should or should not be made to FEMA?
Well, the disaster in Texas, which is awful, is a relatively contained disaster. The problem is when a Hurricane Katrina hits and New Orleans, Louisiana, Mississippi are all devastated. That's when it becomes difficult to imagine that the two states pulling it off by themselves. By the way, FEMA can be reformed. You can make it a lot better. You can save money the way it's currently conducted. On the other hand, I don't think it's possible that a state like Louisiana and Mississippi, those states could have responded on their own. As one example, there were helicopters being brought in by the federal government to evacuate people out of New Orleans when it was all flooded. I'll also go to another example. I once toured the Oklahoma City bombing site. I know that the federal government brought in teams from across the nation to help look for survivors beneath the rubble. Oklahoma won't have those, but the federal government can have a coordinating role. So FEMA can be changed, it can be reformed, absolutely, but let's not forget that sometimes the response is going to require something more than a state has.
I'd like to ask you, Senator, about something else that may or may not need changes. The rescission package currently being considered in your chamber. Will it require tweaks to what the House passed in order to actually get the requisite votes?
Yeah, so I haven't studied it in detail yet. You know, NPR, that's a layup. You know, NPR, it's partisan. Its CEO is clearly partisan, saying terrible things about President Trump, and it's supposed to be nonpartisan. And some of the other stuff we have to look at carefully. I am all about getting waste, fraud, and abuse out of the federal government. Let's just do it. Let's just do it right.
Well, Senator, let's get into your gig worker benefits bill, which is something that I know you're working hard on right now. The Unlocking Benefits for Independent Workers Act would basically allow independent contractors, gig workers, as we call them, to have portable benefits, health insurance, retirement benefits, paid sick leave. As I understand this, and correct me if I'm wrong, this would expand what they call association health plans that a number of different employers would pay into. How does this work? If there's no mandate, how do you compel companies, employers, to fund this coverage?
because the employer is competing for the better independent contractor. They have a choice of where to work. They can be a door dasher, they can work for Uber, they can work for Lyft, or something different. And so this would be a package that the company would offer proactively to get the better not employee, specifically not an employee, but rather independent contractor. And companies have stepped up that they want to do this. The DoorDash people have gone to states attempting to get a safe harbor for them to provide these benefits. So we can see they want to do it. And by the way, the independent contractors, they like being free, they like being independent, but they'd also like the benefits.
Is the hope that this in part would lead to coverage for gig workers who might lose it under the president's big, beautiful bill?
Well, no. Right now they can go to an exchange. And there's no reason why a gig worker should lose benefits under the one big, beautiful bill. That's kind of one thing that the left is pushing out there. No reason at all. But on the other hand, it'd probably be a pretty nice group to insure. The premiums would probably be less than the exchanges, and it would go along with the kind of they're an independent contractor. It gives the worker a choice. They can have the freedom to move locations. At the same time, they would get the health benefits in the 401k that right now some of them feel compelled to stay with an old-fashioned employer, if you will, as opposed to their new system.
Well, Senator, because of the one big beautiful bill and the people who will lose coverage as a result and who are upset about that, are there Democrats willing to work with you on this particular piece of legislation through regular order?
Let me push back. You're suggesting that there's going to be all these people losing coverage. Let's speak about the people who are at risk of losing coverage.
The Congressional Budget Office says there will.
So let me finish. If you talk about someone who's 18 to 64, able-bodied, not disabled, able-bodied, without dependents, then yes, and they don't work, volunteer, or go to school at least 20 hours a week, they can lose their coverage. But I think most Americans would say, and I as a doctor who worked in a hospital for the uninsured for 20 years, hey, you're getting free health insurance. You can at least work, volunteer, or go to school 20 hours a week, and if you do, you will be healthier. Statistically, you will be healthier. And so I'm going to push back a little bit. In fact, I'm going to push back hard on the fact that all these people will lose coverage. If they work, volunteer, or go to school 20 hours a week, they can keep their Medicaid. Now, on the other hand, can we do stuff on health care that would be bipartisan? Absolutely. There are things that both sides agree on that would preserve benefits for somebody on Medicare, for example, but preserve the program longer by cutting out waste, fraud, and abuse. And there's bipartisan bills to that. I think we should work together for that.
Senator, I only have a minute left. I don't want to set you up to cut you off, but where's the opposition on this? Is it teachers' unions?
In terms of the independent contractor?
Is it unions of any sort for that matter? Is it organized labor that you're fighting against?
Two things. We hear that both unions don't like it because they don't want to kind of update labor laws from 100 years ago to make it better for the independent contractor. And secondly, it is, I'm told, some old-fashioned businesses that know that some of their people stay employed because otherwise they lose their benefits. We're trying to update those laws with our focus on the worker, not on the unions, not on the old-line business.
Well, come back and talk to us if this gets across the finish line. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. We look forward to our next conversation with you here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And of course, we'll have many more conversations coming up tomorrow here on Balance of Power. So we'll see you then. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Thanks for being with us live from Washington on Bloomberg.